Hello and welcome to the tentatively named Red Zone podcast. I am your host, Grant Lonero. I am an LSU student, a lifelong fan of not just LSU, but really just about every sport I've ever consumed. Um, this is going to be my podcast where I basically just talk about all the stories in sports that fascinate me and interest me throughout the week. I am going to talk college football. I'm going to talk NFL, NBA. I'll talk some soccer. I'll talk some Formula One and maybe some more, maybe some college basketball, baseball when we get to that season. We'll see. Um, but this week, the first thing that I wanted to talk about is maybe obviously LSU football and starting with their win over UAB. LSU played UAB this weekend in a huge game in the eyes of Brian Kelly. If you listened to his press conferences, and it might seem crazy to say this LSU UAB game was big, but I think it was very very important to get this type of bounce back for the LSU offense, for the LSU team, for Jaden Daniels. It was really, really important. Jaden Daniels getting another big game in his locker before he goes into the stretch where he's facing a really talented A&M defense that is going to be doing everything they can to get a win there. I think him getting this game 22 of 29 for 297 yards in the air, one touchdown, passing 111 rushing yards, another TD on the ground. He was almost perfect throughout the game. One of his best games in an LSU uniform, despite the level of competition, which might not be as low as some people thought, considering the line was hovering around 14.5 to 15.5 for most of the week. So I was really impressed with LSU's ability to bounce back when they've got a big game that they have to win next week, and even more importantly, the SEC championship game against Georgia coming up. It was very good to see Jaden Daniels play like that. Obviously, another star that of the game that I think we might have been surprised by was Noah Kane, who racked up 76 yards and 3 touchdowns on the ground. I was very, very excited to see him in this red zone role with Armani Goodwin and Josh Williams out due to injury. You really got to see Kane get a shot in that role that I think I expected and maybe some others expected him to fill early in the season and in the off season. And he was very strong there. I think he did just about anything you could have expected him to do. Was consistently running through arm tackles, just so low to the ground, very big, just so hard to bring down and to go through the game really. LSU, they on offense it was always there. We were moving the ball from the beginning. Jaden always looked strong. The running game was getting it done in the red zone when we needed. But the defense started a little slow. They weren't helped by the kick return that gave UAB great starting position after the score early. But they were letting UAB pass the ball on them. And the run defense was always doing its job. But early they let that pass offense of UAB really get to them. And I think a lot of LSU fans might have been worried, are we going to drag this out? Are we going to play them close? Is this going to be another letdown game, if you will, after the real letdown game of Arkansas last week in the 13-10 win? But the defense held it together after that first quarter. And like you've seen so many times this season, Matt House is just so good at absorbing that first and second punch maybe of the opposing team's offense and just adjusting and figuring out what needs to be done and really locking it down on that front and letting the offense get a chance to either, as we saw early in the year, come back from a lot of deficits that they might put us in, and nowadays, really just build gaps or help us score a lot and build that gap so we can have more comfortable wins like you saw against Ole Miss and now UAB. So it's good to see our offense have this type of day. The defense, there's a lot more talent on this defense that I think people realized coming into the year, and a lot of that has to do with Harold Perkins' emergence. And he's just it's tough for me to add anything that hasn't already been said about Harold Perkins, because he's such a special football player. On the year now, 57 tackles, 6.5 or 7.5 sacks, depending on what site I'm looking at, an interception, 2 pass deflections, a forced fumble. Something most people won't know, actually, is that Harold Perkins in the SEC has the second best passer rating against of any linebacker. The only linebacker who has a better passer rating against is Micah Baskerville, actually. So LSU's got some really, really good linebackers in terms of coverage, which I honestly think is something that's going to help a lot against Georgia, actually, because I think they may, obviously they have Bowers, but I think they may use a lot of tight end and wingback motion in order to try and keep Baskerville and Perkins from disrupting plays, but they're also very strong there, so it may truly come down to a battle of the offensive and defensive fronts for LSU and Georgia, which is going to be very interesting, because Georgia, just that mauling O-line that they've had since Kirby's gotten there, 5- and 4-star talent all down it. But LSU's had an incredibly strong D-line. The interior had been very good. Perkins, whenever he shifted there, is an obvious threat. Ojulari's had his best season for LSU. Just an amazing all-around player. So it's going to be a very interesting matchup if LSU can just continue to take care of business and get their 10-2. Some big news in the rest of college football. Something that I think a lot of LSU fans looked at, reclined, and watched with a smile, as Tennessee lost to South Carolina, and this is crazy for me to even read now, 63-38. That is just to say it's not something I expected at all. I was actually someone who thought maybe if LSU finishes strong enough, there was a chance that LSU could jump Tennessee. If they beat Georgia convincingly, maybe the committee would value that the recency bias and the SEC championship over the head-to-head and the more losses. With how early the losses to Tennessee and especially Florida State were, and the fact that both were ranked teams. But you really don't even have to worry about that anymore. I was not expecting that. I think everybody was eagerly watching TCU, and later actually Michigan, once it was seen that was getting close as well, to see, is LSU going to be able to move up? But I think the last place people were expecting to look was Tennessee getting just beat down by South Carolina, even before the very unfortunate injury to Hendon Hooker. So whether LSU jumps up to 5 or whether USC jumps them, it's undeniably a positive, because now all LSU needs is either TCU or USC to lose once, and they undeniably control their own destiny. So a very, very big Tennessee loss versus South Carolina. It's just not something I think any of us expected. But speaking of USC, a huge, huge, huge win against UCLA. And it wasn't perfect. Not that I think anybody expected it to be. It was a huge, huge matchup. Part of what was hyped as sort of the de facto Pac-10, Pac-12 semifinals, where you had UCLA and USC in the South, and in the North you had Utah versus Oregon. And so the two winners of those games we're gonna meet in the Pac-12 championship. and that was it's very big. And USC took care of business. LSU fans would have been pulling for UCLA the whole way. Dorian Thompson-Robinson, with a heroic second half effort, was beat up the whole time, was getting hit so hard, was still putting it all on the line. One of his best games I think I've ever seen, and maybe in his entire college career, as long as it's been. So impressive. It was such a shame to see him throw that interception on the last drive, because it truly would have been like an iconic, legendary performance. Caleb Williams was fantastic. He is a true Heisman dark horse. He is someone who is one of the most important players on their team in the country, but he plays late. His team has a loss, and he plays in a slightly weaker conference, so I don't think people fully appreciate the type of quarterback he is. But he is a very, very good college quarterback, and has been from the second he stepped on the field with Oklahoma. You can really see why Lincoln is such a fan. So USC gets a big win. It'll be very interesting to see in the college football playoff rankings whether USC or LSU gets that number 5 spot that Tennessee will be leaving vacant. I expect it to be USC, but I also think that it doesn't matter, and what happened this weekend is pretty much already good enough for LSU fans, to be honest. And I think they can be pretty happy with what happened in the last week. So now, to look on to the next week, the big one is LSU versus Texas A&M. And there's not much to say about this that hasn't been said. LSU, the SEC West champion. Texas A&M, the last place team in the SEC, not the SEC West, last place in the SEC, 1-6, the only team with only one SEC win all season. They have been truly horrendous. They played UMass last weekend to the tune of about 500 crowd members, and they beat them 20-3, which is the second, or tied for the lowest any team has scored against UMass this season, which is just shockingly bad. The job Jimbo Fisher is doing this season is abhorrently bad, truly awful. But it is undeniable that Texas A&M has an abundance of talent, and it is also undeniable that this is an enormous game for them. They want to win this more than anything. They can ruin our season before anybody else gets the chance. So this is a very big spot for them. We are going to have to come out strong. I think if we get a lead early, we may be able to just put it into cruise, but we cannot let them get ahead and make this game difficult for us. We can't make early mistakes on offense like we saw in the Arkansas game. I think it just affects Jaden's confidence too much. He needs to start strong. We need to do everything we can to make sure that's the case. But it's a huge game for so many different reasons. Another of which, it's a chance for our second season since 2012 to start, or to finish the regular season with 10 wins. The only other obviously being 2019, which is something that I think is really impressive. In Brian Kelly's first season, that would be something that is truly impressive. So it's a huge game. I'm eager to see how we come out. It'll definitely be very interesting. Next up, I am going to talk about the Saints for as little as I possibly can, and I think you guys will understand that. The Saints this week beat the Los Angeles Rams 27-22 in a war of attrition. Both teams this year are just so not good. If you would have told a Saints fan this offseason they would have been favored going into the game, I think they would have thought this season was going a lot different than it is. But both teams are just not there this year. Injuries have absolutely ravaged both teams. So it wasn't a great show, but the Saints got it done 27-20. Normally, In a normal season like this, you might not actually be that happy about it, but we don't have a first round pick, so there's no reason to hope we lose unless you're just that desperate for Dennis Allen to be gone, which I think will likely take care of itself. Um, Andy Dalton had a big week. It wasn't a perfect game, but it was, for him, it was undeniably good, and it came in a big week, with Jameis doing his interview, talking about how heartbroken he was losing the job, how he lost the job either due or during an injury, however you want to phrase it, whatever you think about the situation. Um, and I think it really put the pressure on Dalton, because if he has another bad week here, Jameis does that interview, it just becomes even harder for Dennis Allen to keep Dalton out there. And Dennis Allen is stubborn, don't get me wrong. I'm not saying he couldn't have. But I think now you've got another reason to run Dalton out next week, which, I cannot lie and say excites me. But it is the case, and it's what Saints fans are going to have to deal with. And it's a penalty of how we've run the team in the last year or two, and some of the moves we've made in trades that I just don't agree with, that have cost us these picks. And so now this is pretty much a totally moot season. One of the only things that I think undeniably people can be very, very excited about, very optimistic about on the Saints team is Chris Olave. Chris Olave is having a phenomenal rookie season. Easily the best rookie wide receiver. He's put in some real performances this year. I think just about every Saints fan could agree that maybe that's the brightest spot of this year, has been his performance and him really showing the potential that he has. And he's been doing this with some honestly poor and inconsistent quarterback play. So I think that makes it even more impressive, all things considered. Not that the other rookie wide receivers he's competing with are getting great quarterback play. Drake London, Garrett Wilson are playing with Zach Wilson and Marcus Mariota. So, that speaks for itself. But I think it's still very impressive, what we've seen from him. And I'll definitely continue to keep an eye out and enjoy very much watching him, because he's a fun player to watch. He's just a really, really tidy wide receiver. But next up, I wanted to talk about my New Orleans Pelicans. I have been a huge Pelicans fan through everything since I've been a kid, since they were the Hornets. And I have this weird, maybe it's not weird, pride in the fact that I'm a Pelicans fan, because unlike the Saints, who have won a Super Bowl, and since I've started watching around 2006, because I was 8, they've been pretty great. LSU has been unbelievable, the second best program in the country since I've been alive. So with them, I've got this sort of pride that I've been a fan even in their downtimes. So I'm very excited to talk about this year's team, because I think it's one of those teams that just undeniably has the talent and should coast to the playoffs without perilous injury problems or mismanagement from the coach. Right now, they are sitting at 9-7. They are 9th in the Western Conference standings. However, they're only 2 games back on first place. I think we're in an okay spot. I came into the year with very high expectations, and to be clear, those expectations are not gone. I did perhaps hope that we would start out a little stronger. I think there have been some games where we have just not found our rhythm. We've had some of the wrong guys taking shots. I think some of our bench players, I think CJ McCollum as well, have generally taken a few too many of our shots this year. I think a lot more of our shots probably should have gone in the direction of Brandon Ingram and Zion Williamson. But even with that said, with a lot of people, maybe saying, hey, we should be playing a little better, we should be doing a little better, maybe Willie Green should be making different decisions. Even with that said, we're 9-7. We're 2 games back on first place. We have a winning record. And my Pelicans do not generally start off the year very well. So I'm very, very, to be honest, I'm thrilled with it. There's a big game now versus Golden State tonight. Zion Williamson is expected to be back. Trey Murphy is questionable, which with our staff has generally meant he will not play. We'll see. I'm saying this a few hours before the game. I don't actually know yet, but it should be interesting. The Warriors will be sitting out their big 3. So the Pelicans should, keyword, be able to get a win here no matter what. A big thing to monitor will be Devontae Graham versus Jose Alvarado's minutes. And I think that's been something that's been contested the whole year. Because I think coming out of that postseason where Jose Alvarado was so strong, you really saw the emergence of the Grand Theft Alvarado meme. But even just his face-up one-on-one defense was so crucial. And just to see Devontae Graham still get the nod over him at times and the priority off the bench it's just very odd to me because Graham is a decent shooter, but he's not a great shooter. And Jose Alvarado is not a terrible 3-point shooter. He's not as good as Graham. But I just think he brings you more in terms of ball handling, in terms of mentality, in terms of defense, to the point where it's perplexed me why Devontae Graham gets those looks first. But I think that's something to keep an eye out for in the next few games. I don't think necessarily that will stay the case, but maybe it will. We'll see. Another thing that I saw that I just thought was funny and I wanted to talk about for just a second was the Giannis free throw ladder incident, which really just was so funny to me. NBA fans are just so funny in their own way. They're just so foolish and they just jump to conclusions and they're so wishy-washy. And they're just waiting for these players to do something wrong so they can pile on him. If you don't know, Giannis, after a loss to the 76ers last week, he went to go shoot free throws after the game. This is something that, since I've been a kid, I've known to happen. I mean, the Kobe is iconic for doing this, for missing a free throw and then going back out after the game and being like, hey, I'm going to hit 50 in a row. And it's like the Mamba mentality that the young generation of NBA fans want to tout so strongly, and yet Giannis does this, and I agree that it doesn't look great, but even the moment I saw it, my first thought was, hey, we don't know what happened. That seems like a pretty normal thing to do. I wonder how this transpired. And then the report comes out later that he was shooting to begin with, and then 76ers player Montrezl Harrell comes out and starts talking to him, giving a little back. He's like, get off my court. Then while they're talking, the worker starts moving the ladder back. And maybe Giannis should have been more careful with the ladder. I think it's crazy how much people care about a literal ladder, as long as he was not actually harassing the employee, which it seems like he clearly wasn't from the video. But, you know, it's just, I think it really sums up NBA fans and maybe sports fans as a whole. Giannis is a seemingly great guy, a very good role model as far as athletes are concerned, and people were just waiting to pile on him and say he's a dirty player, say he's cocky, say he's an asshole. It was just very disappointing to see, and I was very glad to see Giannis come out the other side, and it really looked like, hey, he was probably fine. He was probably in the right a little bit. But yeah, the World Cup in Qatar has started. The World Cup 2022. And I've been, yeah, my emotions regarding this tournament are hard to explain because I miss the classic nostalgia of when I first started watching soccer, and I would see a summer World Cup in a country with football heritage. And there's been a lot of disappointing news that I've seen out of Qatar, and the environments maybe haven't been perfect. But once you get watching, it really has sort of piqued my interest once again. Um, and the important thing today, there have been matches previously. Ecuador beat Qatar 2-0, and the Netherlands beat Senegal 1-0. But the two matches today that were concerning for American fans would be England beat Iran 6-2, a very, very, very strong start for them. They looked very good. It wasn't perfect. They didn't want to let up 2 goals, and the score ended up being a little misleading. I don't think they outplayed them by quite as badly as the score looked, but for goal difference, that won't matter. They will be happy with that performance. They looked very cohesive in attack. Sterling and Saka were quite phenomenal. Grealish and Wilson came on, did well. They looked very good, and England today really cemented the fact that they are the team to be scared of in this group, that some would argue is the group of death. Something I'm going to be looking out for in the U.S. and England's game on Friday is that left side of Raheem Sterling and Luke Shaw going up against Serginho Dest and Weston McKennie on the U.S.'s right. The U.S.'s right, when McKennie and Dest and Weah were in, did not look incredibly weak. It was shaky at times. Adams had to bring in a lot of help, but I don't think it was as bad as maybe I expected. It is going to be a totally different challenge versus the class of England. On Friday, you've got Raheem Sterling, who's an absolute nightmare one-on-one. You've got Shaw, who can really overlap, but is also a capable defender, will be banging in the crosses. It's going to be a very, very interesting matchup. And I think after today's result, the U.S. may not be as optimistic as they expected. The U.S. drew with Wales 1-1 after an undeniably good start. The U.S. dominated the first half. They were far, far, far the better team. There was only one shot on goal, but it was a bit misleading. There was an own goal potentially that was saved by Hennessy well. There was a Sargent header that just went off the post that even looked like maybe it was saved originally onto the post by Hennessy. But regardless, a very close chance. So there were chances. It wasn't perfect, but the U.S. dominated the possession battle. They had the better of the chances. Wales looked hopeless on the counter. And Landon Donovan at the half said, you have to keep the foot on the gas pedal. You have to continue the intensity and build for another goal or two. Get this to 2-0, 3-0. And that did not happen. Greg Berhalter, you have to look at him when it comes to the intensity and the style that the U.S. showed in the second half. It was not good. From the beginning, the composure on the ball, the possession was gone, really. And that was something that was so impressive from the first half. It was one of the best US 11s that I think I've witnessed in my time watching them. And then the play was good. The goal was fantastic. It was a beautiful, beautiful, beautiful goal. You've got the great dribble and carry by Pulisic. You had the amazing hold-up play by Sargent, actually, which goes under the radar. And then the beautiful outside-of-the-foot finish by Weah to pin it past him. And you go up 1-0 and you're feeling great. Ream and Robinson have been playing amazing. Pulisic in the second half of the first half, or the second part, I suppose, was really phenomenal. He was a magician on the ball, and that was what you wanted to see. But in the second half, it wasn't there. Weston McKennie, in particular, in his first game back in a long time, he's had quad struggles. He's been working to get back. He hasn't been playing for Juventus recently. He got back, and I think it was quite clear that maybe he wasn't all there yet. I don't think it was all bad, but of the midfield, I think it's pretty undeniable that he was the weak link. His first touch was questionable. At times, it looked like he didn't want to run as much as maybe he could have. He wasn't coming to the ball. Tyler Adams and Musa, a lot of the time in the second half especially, needed help on the ball. They needed somebody to come to them, and it just wasn't happening from McKennie, which was unfortunate. Wales, in the second half, though, you can't all just take it away from the U.S. You need to give some credit to Wales. Their subs were great. They played much better football. Bale started really to click. He started to work some magic in that final third. The problem was, if you give away one of those counters or those open play goals when they're playing well, maybe it's not as tough to stomach, but giving away the penalty in the way that Zimmerman did was just so brutal. It's just such an unnecessary penalty. Bale's facing away from goal. It looked like he was going to get a decent touch, but it was so clearly not needed in the 81st minute. Just do your best to hold on. You don't need to go for that. You've seen that penalty so many times, though. Very reminiscent of Ruben Diaz versus Karim Benzema in last year's Champions League semifinal extra time. It's not needed. It really wasn't needed. And even after the penalty, the U.S. sort of took the initiative, but it wasn't like they were getting great chances. It was bouncing back and forth. It was very much up in the air who was the stronger team of the two, and that was not the case in the first half. That was not what U.S. fans would have been hoping to see. And I'm disappointed with how the team came out in the second half. Whether that was on the players or Berhalter, I won't pretend to know. But it was not. It was very disappointing. And what this draw means now is that you are dependent on two things: how badly you can beat Iran. If you want to make it through, Wales and the U.S. will both be trying to beat Iran and beat them by as many goals as they can, since they're equal on points, and they will be trying to lose to England by as few as possible. Obviously, they'll be trying to beat or draw with England. I just don't think that's realistic. I think there's just too much quality in England's side. I think that's a losing battle for the U.S. and Wales. Maybe I'll be proven wrong. I'd love if I was in the case of the U.S. Even a draw would be fantastic. I don't see it, but we'll wait till Friday. We'll see. They'll have a chance. So, my secret sports fandom that I guess has developed more recently than all of these others that I've talked about is Formula One. And I haven't really been a racing fan since I was very young. Me and my dad would watch NASCAR. And that stopped when I was pretty young. I want to say 10 to 12, somewhere around there. And it was interesting, but I never thought about it. And I never thought about other motorsports or racing circuits or leagues until I watched a YouTube video. I want to shout him out. CY Motorsport on YouTube has some incredible Formula One narrative videos that really got me into the sport. And this year I've been absolutely glued to it. And it's been unbelievably interesting for me to follow. And at the base level, you might say, what's so interesting about cars racing around in a circle or a circuit, because they're not circles in Formula One, but the nuance to the sport is unlike, I think, anything I've ever seen in any other sport. The rivalries between drivers within the same team, the hierarchy of the teams, the fact that that different teams have different levels of car, and that the teams can develop them at different rates, and you can spend certain amounts of money. It's so interesting to me. But what I want to talk about most specifically here is the Abu Dhabi GP and the conclusion to the 2022 season. Max Verstappen, my favorite, I say sarcastically, was the winner again, and it was a fantastic drive. You can't deny it. He cruised to the victory very comfortably, just slowly built up a comfortable gap on Leclerc. And despite the difference in strategy from Leclerc and Perez, Perez going to stop Leclerc, wearing out those hards to the end and managing to stay slightly ahead of Perez, nobody was going to touch Verstappen. But Leclerc did secure second in the race, managed to keep about a 2-second gap on Perez to the end, and took second in the race and second in the World Drivers' Championship. So, that's very, very, very big for the drivers. And I think that's something that, to a fan, maybe it doesn't make a ton of sense, because I was surprised at first, but once you saw in Brazil how much second place in the Drivers' Championship meant to both Leclerc and Perez, this was a big result. And I think Leclerc really showed his class and showed why he's not to be blunt or disrespectful to Checo, but Charles Leclerc is a better driver than Sergio Perez, and he did it in a worse car at Abu Dhabi, and he took second. And it was a huge result for him and Ferrari in what started off as a great year, but slowly deteriorated into something they probably will want to forget sooner rather than later. They did secure second in the Constructors' Championship with a rough race for Mercedes. The pace was never there. Hamilton DNF due to a mechanical failure. I believe it was his gearbox. Alonso went out even earlier. That was a shame to see, because that trio of great drivers, Hamilton, Alonso, Vettel from the last generation, you would have loved to see that moment where they repeat the past Abu Dhabi scenes and they get the triple donut going, and you get a perfect send-off for Sebastian Vettel, who scored a point. But unfortunately, Alpine and Mercedes couldn't quite get us there in terms of the reliability. But still an amazing send-off for Vettel. I was so happy he got a point. The interviews that he did this weekend, Lewis Hamilton seems to believe he's going to come back. I don't know if I think so. The way he spoke about it all weekend, he seemed so at peace and content with the decision and his future, and it's something that I really admire, because being the best and still being one of the best, being able to step back when you can still perform at that level is something that I think not all people can do. And so it's very impressive for me. I was so happy for Sebastian. It was a great finish to the year. Rounding up the 2022 season, there's not a ton to say at the top. Max Verstappen finishes with 454 points. Absolutely dominant year. One of the best seasons we've seen from a driver recently, in one of the best cars we've seen from a constructor recently. Just a phenomenal effort from Red Bull, and specifically Verstappen. A dominant year. As we go down further, Sergio Perez, Charles Leclerc had an amazing battle for second and third all year, where Leclerc managed to just edge it out. And that's huge for him. I think it's huge for the psyche going into next year. There was obviously some friction in Ferrari between Mattia Binotto and Charles Leclerc. So I think that's definitely something that maybe greases the friction a bit and brings up the vibes in Ferrari, so to speak. I did a bit of thinking about this, and I was thinking, who are the best and worst drivers from the 2022 season? And I didn't just want to pick chalk. I didn't want to just say, hey, these are the guys that everybody's piled on, that everybody knows had the best and worst cars. But at a certain point, it's tough not to. My best drivers for the year, I think it's almost impossible to say that the best was not Max Verstappen. Incredible effort, enormous gap at the top, never in doubt. 15 wins, as many DNFs as podium finishes outside of first. So, I mean, it was something special from him this year, truly. Next up, Lando Norris took that next step this year and really became the driver that I think McLaren could have always hoped he would be for them as their number one. He won the qualifying battle with Daniel Ricciardo this year, 18-4. It was an incredible effort. In 22 of the races, 18 of them, he was the quicker driver in qualification. An average gap that was absolutely enormous, 0.3. So it's just, he was one of the most dominant drivers on the grid relative to his teammate, and Daniel Ricciardo is a legendary driver. 8 wins, countless podiums, a lot of success with Red Bull. Even when he was racing Verstappen in Red Bull, it was never even close to this realm of dominance. So you've really seen, I think, at the same time, Norris take that next step, but Ricciardo lose his focus and maybe not be where he wants to be as a driver, which is partially why he'll be taking the year off. And we'll see if he comes back. I think also you cannot take away the type of year that Charles Leclerc had. He finished second in the drivers. And I think some people might say, oh, that's where he should finish. I don't necessarily agree. I think past the first few races, at best the Ferrari was even on some tracks with the Red Bull. And I think Perez, if he would have taken care of business, Perez should have taken second. He was in a much better car, especially in the end of the year when it wasn't even close. And at times Ferrari were battling Mercedes to even have the second best car. And I think Charles Leclerc had maybe it'll go as an underappreciated year. He was the best qualifier. I think he continues to be the best hot lap driver on the grid. What he can do in qualifying is magical, the type pace he can squeeze out of the car. I think Ferrari with Sainz as well, who I think is a great driver. I think if Ferrari can put it together next year, I really want them to. I think it would be super interesting. Worst drivers, let's get this one out of the way. Nobody needs any explanation on this one. Nicholas Latifi, I love him. He seems like a nice guy. He was out of place this entire year. Undeniably the worst driver on the grid. There was only one that I think was even arguably close to him in terms of the lack of quality. It's hard to compare them because of the difference in car performance and team. But just such a rough year for Latifi. It really started to get exposed that there was a gap between him and everybody else on the grid, especially once Albon started to feel comfortable in that Williams and he started to do things that Latifi just can't, which is why he's extended and why Sargent is going to be replacing Latifi as the only American driver on the grid, which I'm personally very excited about. I think the next worst driver, and I think the only one maybe in the same realm as Latifi in terms of quality this year, was probably Ricciardo, which is a shame because I really like Ricciardo. But this was an undeniably poor year from him. As I stated, 4-18 in the qualification battle, 0.3 average behind Lando in qualification. That's an enormous gap. In the races, it wasn't much better. He was careless. He made mistakes. He didn't have the pace. It was all over the place for him. And the car wasn't perfect, but when you see what Norris could squeeze out of it, the only 100-point midfield driver, and he got up to 122, it's hard not to be disappointed in this season from Daniel Ricciardo. And the only driver that was close to him and Latifi in terms of qualifying gap to their number one driver was Sergio Perez, who is my last driver here, which I think is maybe the hottest take and the biggest surprise that I've put into these rankings. But Sergio Perez did not have a good enough year for the car he was in. In Monaco, he won. There is a ton of scrutiny that he purposely crashed in order to hold qualifying position over Max Verstappen. It's not proved. I won't act like it is, but there are many drivers who have commented on how suspicious it looks. That was able to give him the preferred strategy over Verstappen. He gets the win on Monaco, which is an incredibly hard track to overtake. Then in Singapore, he wins due to Verstappen's worst qualifying of the year. Verstappen was faster than him even there. And I'm not trying to take away the fact that Perez is a very good driver on street circuits. He is. On city circuits, he's a great driver. But there is a gap that is undeniable and not close to the gaps that you see on the other top teams. In terms of qualifying pace, there is a 300th gap between Russell and Hamilton in Hamilton's favor on the year. In Ferrari, there's a 1/10th gap in favor of Leclerc. In Red Bull, there's a 3.2 gap to Perez. That's so much worse than he should be doing. And it's quite disappointing. I think next year I'll really be looking for Checo to improve. But I think it's going to be very interesting. 2023 is going to be a big year for Formula One. The first year of new regulations is often the least competitive, especially for the midfield trying to fight with the top teams. I think next year we could see the benefits of these regulations. I think we could see Alpine with their new lineup of Ocon and Gasly, and we could see Piastri and Norris with McLaren maybe push for over 200 points. It'll be very interesting. Maybe some wins from teams that aren't the top teams, but we'll see. That's not always guaranteed. But even podiums from teams that weren't the top teams. Norris was the only driver outside of the top three teams to score a podium this year. That's not something that's super entertaining for any team but the top three. And speaking of the top three, I think it's going to be very interesting to see where the development battle leads for next year. I mean, Red Bull had a rocket ship this year. Mercedes improved their car throughout the year, and by the end was probably the second best on most tracks. Ferrari has started the year with an incredible template and just failed to develop, but it's been rumored that they started development on their next car earlier than any of the top three teams. So it's going to be very interesting. Could there be 3 championship contending cars? I think that's the hope for neutral Formula One fans. I think it'll be very interesting. In terms of drivers, it's hard to imagine somebody having a bigger advantage than Verstappen. He's the only driver in the top 6 among the top 3 teams that has a true number 1 status and will get that preferential strategy and team orders 100% of the time. So I think it's going to be very interesting. It's tough for me to imagine if Red Bull don't still have the best car that Verstappen won't repeat. But it's going to be very, very interesting. I'm very excited. That is going to be it for my first episode of The Red Zone. I really hope you guys enjoyed it. Tune in next week. I will try to be very consistent with these. I'm also going to try and upload clips on my YouTube channel of certain segments. So just keep in touch. Try and keep listening. Really appreciate everybody who listened to this one. Peace.